excited to share this information with you about service animals and emotional support animals to help you as domestic violence service providers to know how to respond to someone that may be accessing your services or in need of your services. And also, please refer to the domestic violence policy that we've just developed specific to service animals. This policy will provide you with a lot of different information and detail that you may need as you're working to serve individuals that come to your program that have a service animal or an emotional support animal.
It's important that we understand the terms when we're talking about service animals, emotional support animals, therapy animals, and pets or companion animals. It can all get very confusing, but each term has its own regulations and laws around it and its own definitions.
A service animal, as defined by the Americans with Disabilities Act, is a dog or a miniature horse that's under 100 pounds that's been trained to assist someone with a disability like me to perform different tasks that can make them be more independent. Actually, it's surprising that service animals really don't have to have any kind of specific certification, but they do have to be able to perform at least one task that's specific to someone's disability. For example, Lovey is trained to retrieve because as a person with a mobility limitation, I can't bend over to pick up things or I might fall out of my wheelchair. So a true service animal is going to be trained to do at least one and usually a lot more tasks specific to someone's disability.
Service animals have what's called public access, which means they can go anywhere the public can go. That means grocery stores, restaurants, businesses, hospitals, wherever.
It's really important as advocates that we know what we can and what we can't ask because it can be a slippery slope. So it's really important to know that there are two things you can ask. One is this a service animal? And the second question that you can ask is what task does this dog or miniature horse perform? And keep in mind that you cannot ask what type of disability does a person have.
Emotional support animals can be any animal. Their handler must have a documented disability, and they will have that documentation provided by a doctor or a licensed mental health professional saying that this person has a disability and is in need of and benefited by an emotional support animal. Emotional support animals are not necessarily trained to do anything. They are not necessarily trained to perform work or to do any tasks because of that disability. Their job really is to provide comfort, and just their mere fact of being there with their handler provides that emotional support and that comfort without them having to be trained to do anything else. Emotional support animals are different than service animals because of that training piece and the fact they can be any animal. Emotional support animals do not have public access, and that is very important to know. Emotional support animals, really what they are allowed to do is travel on planes with their handler, and it also gives them protections regarding housing. The important part for domestic violence shelters to know is that emotional support animals, as long as they have the documentation that their handler has a documented disability and this documentation that an emotional support animal is necessary and beneficial by a doctor or a licensed mental health professional, then the emotional support animal has housing privileges under the Fair Housing Act. That means that a domestic violence shelter would need to accept an emotional support animal so long as it meets those requirements and they have the documentation. Remember that survivors with emotional support animals may have had to flee their homes rapidly without documentation for their emotional support animal. Our recommendation is that domestic violence shelters start by believing, as we do with all of our survivors, and that we accept the survivor and their emotional support animal into safe shelter, and then assist them to get that documentation, just like we would with any other documents that they may have had to leave behind, like birth certificates or even medications.
Therapy animals can be any type of animal which makes visits with its owner to people and places to provide stress relief, fun, or motivation for education or therapy. Some examples of therapy animals are dogs that visit schools where children practice reading aloud to them, miniature horses and llamas that visit patients in nursing homes, or cats or bunnies or dogs that visit patients in hospitals. Therapy animals are typically registered by a therapy animal organization, such as Pet Partners. They do not have specialized training, but must pass an obedience and temperament test by their sponsoring organization. Therapy animals do not have any public access or housing privileges. They are only allowed to make therapy visits in public settings, with pre-approval by that particular organization or school. If a survivor says they have a therapy animal, a domestic violence program should treat it as it would treat a survivor's pet. Remember, sometimes people confuse the terms between emotional support animals and therapy animals, especially when they are under stress. So talk with the survivor. Ask them, is their animal a therapy animal that supports many other people? Or is it an emotional support animal that assists them with their disability? So in New Mexico, it's becoming more common for domestic violence shelters and programs to have therapy animals. Mostly dogs come and visit their shelters to provide stress relief for their residents and clients, or work alongside counselors and forensic interviewers in child advocacy centers. We encourage domestic violence programs to explore these options, but the presence of therapy dogs in this context does not impact a shelter or program's policies around survivors coming to services with therapy animals.
So when we look at therapy animals, we look at service animals, we look at pets. There's a variety of different ways that we'll approach that as we have someone entering our shelter.
If an animal is not a service animal or an emotional support animal, then it is a companion animal or a pet.
If someone is trying to access your services and they have a companion animal or a pet and you do not have the capacity to house the animal, there are resources out there. The Companion Animal Rescue Effort helps individuals who are accessing shelter find temporary housing for their companion animal or pet, and they can help house the animal for up to 90 days until the individual is able to find more permanent housing. So it's important for people to know that there is a link between domestic violence and animal abuse. There's a large percentage of individuals that will not leave a dangerous situation out of fear that their pet will be harmed. So it's important to know that there are resources out there. I think as a domestic violence service provider, it's important to understand what your biases are. It's always good practice to believe the survivor when they reach out to you, just as they would as they're telling you their story. It's just as important to believe them when they are telling you that they have a service animal or emotional support animal. So our hope is that domestic violence programs are able to have the resources and knowledge to be able to be accessible to survivors of domestic violence that have service animals and emotional support animals. By putting up barriers to individuals who are accessing services, we're not fulfilling our mission to serve domestic violence survivors in the best way that we can.
And if you'd like more information or training or technical assistance, please don't hesitate to contact the Domestic Violence Coalition. So thank you for the work that you're doing and for being open and not denying services to people who may be in great need.